Good afternoon to those on the East Coast of the U.S. or Canada, and good morning or good lunchtime to those somewhere in the middle or somewhere on the West Coast of either country. I'm Jane Harmon, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I'm on phone, not Zoom, from our nation's capital. This is close to the 150th ground truth briefing hosted by the Wilson Center. And discussions like today's are the reason we have been named the #1 think tank in the world for regional studies 3 times in a row. We have over 300 RSVPs for this event, which makes you listening in people who have curious minds and want to be smarter about this issue, which is COVID-19 and the northern border, and you will be smarter, I guarantee you, at the end of the hour. The pandemic has caused, no one has missed this, the United States to close its borders to flights from China and the European Union. But what has gotten less attention is that the U.S. has been working jointly and effectively with Canada and Mexico to allow essential transit across our borders. This keeps the flow of goods and essential personnel like nurses coming into the U.S., for example, from Windsor to Detroit in order to help us fight COVID-19 in the U.S. And the flow goes the other way, too. Our Canada and Mexico institutes have been following these developments from the start. We're collecting firsthand perspectives from our global fellows and friends on the ground. Obviously, that is how we will learn how effective this strategy is. Check out, by the way, our website where you will find, quote, reports from North America's borders, experts react to new COVID-19 travel restrictions. We are updating that entry regularly, and it should be a must-add to your quarantine reading list. Today's discussion includes some contributors to that webpage. We'll hear from Alan Burson, the former Acting Commissioner of Customs and Border Patrol and former DHS Assistant Secretary, Catherine Friedman of the University of Buffalo, and Lori Troutman of West Washington University, all of them global fellows at the Wilson Center. We'll also hear from Solomon Wong, the President and CEO of InterVistas, a transportation-focused consulting firm based in Vancouver, British Columbia, who is assessing how the new restrictions apply to the U.S.-Canada air border. Moderating our discussion is our newly minted, or he's not newly minted, but it's Christopher Sands, the newly minted and talented director of the Canada Institute. Chris is still relatively new to the Wilson family, but just like the rest of us, he had no clue he'd been running the Canada Institute under stay-at-home orders. Special thanks to him and his team for their hard work and excellent programming in these difficult times. Please join me in welcoming Chris Sands.
Thank you very much, Jane, and I really appreciate your leadership at this difficult time. The Wilson Center has done an amazing job of pivoting to covering COVID-19, and not just the disease itself, but all of the things, the public policy challenges that flow from it. And I'm very excited that we have our group of experts here today. I'm going to turn first to Alan Burson. Alan, you recently wrote a piece for Woodrow Wilson that really identified the Canada-U.S. cooperation, the U.S.-Mexico cooperation on the border as a sort of bright spot in the post-COVID-19 reaction. Can you tell us a little bit about why you felt that way and what you think is working well? Don't have Alan. Alan, you might not be demuted. Can you unmute your phone? There you are.
Okay. I said thank you, Chris, and sorry that my video, Zoom video, is not functioning, so I'm calling in by phone. But yes, in fact, the U.S.-Canada and U.S.-Mexico borders in times of crisis have not usually been bright spots. So it is actually delightful to find that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the reaction to it, that it is a bright spot. That in fact it has lessons for what was done and what was not done by the three governments in North America. So, for example, what it did not do, it did not lead to a total shutdown of the border. In the wake of 9/11, we all recall, with regard to the border with Canada, as with Mexico, the traffic was backed up 20 miles north into Canada as CBP officers examined every passenger and opened every trunk. There was little distinction made between passengers, essential or otherwise, and cargo. In this case, we see the governments actually working beforehand to come up with a plan that limited non-essential travel by people, but actually recognized the importance of maintaining the shared production platform that we've built up over the last generation between Canada and the United States, and kept the flow of cargo moving essentially intact and without restriction. Second, it was not a unilateral action, unlike 9/11, which, although in the context of the Al-Qaeda attack, it was understandable that the United States reacted by shutting down its airports, seaports, and grinding the land border crossings to a halt. In this case, there was actual consultation, starting first between the governments of Canada and the United States, and then between the United States and Mexico. But essentially what we ended up with was a North American approach to border crossing. In some ways, for the first time that we've seen a trilateral result coming out of the parallel bilateral negotiations that took place. Third, we didn't see an indefinite shutdown, partial closure. We had a measured statement released by the United States and by Canada, and reciprocally by the United States and Mexico, that said this was announced on the 18th of March to go into effect on the 21st of March, with a review 30 days later in April, on April 21st, in which this will be evaluated. So in fact, what we saw was an example when in fact the circumstances might have led to a different result, a unilateral total shutdown for an indefinite period. In fact, even more so than 9/11, the epidemiological analysis would have suggested that there would be a shutdown, a total shutdown, because of the need to social distance and to avoid the spread across the border or elsewhere in the three societies. But instead, we saw in effect a compromise solution that recognized the importance of keeping the supply chain open, given the integrated continental production platforms that we've built up between Canada and the United States, and among Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And so that the dictates of public health were balanced, I think, quite sagely and wisely with the requirements of economics and the economy. And as we look forward, I think a couple of things. The experience, for the most part, that the reports that we saw reported by our colleagues at specific points on the northern U.S. border, the southern Canadian border, showed that, in fact, people have been cooperating, that we did not see panic or confusion, but rather the way in which the governments have handled it have set the stage for actually going much further. And if, in fact, the large issue that we face across Canada and the United States, as well as across the world, is how do we actually restart the economy? How do we actually, within the requirements of public health and to maintain the kinds of restraints that will be in effect, at least partially, for quite some time until a vaccine is developed. For the first time, I think we can say, Chris, that instead of being an area of conflict and of dissension and division, the border may have pointed the way to the kind of cooperation, the kind of balanced approach that may well be an example for our countries to employ even beyond the border region. So I think, as I said at the outset, a bright spot, and that's a testament of the extent to which North America and the interdependence of the United States and Canada, and the United States, Mexico, and Canada have created a North America that, even in the case of leaders who do not terribly believe in globalization, we've seen an example, and in this respect, I think one that will come in very useful as we work our way more generally out of the crisis. Let me stop there, and happy to come back later with further comment, Chris.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Alan. And before we lose you in this particular thought, a quick follow-up. You and I were speaking the other day, and you highlighted something that I hadn't realized, which is that the Department of Homeland Security had reacted to some of the criticism that perhaps 3M and other companies would be unable to ship, or were being ordered not to ship, personal protective equipment to Canada, to Latin America, but that DHS had stepped forward on that and tried to clear the air. Can you share a little bit of that with our viewers?
Sure. Both with respect to the 3M decision had been apparently had been taken at the White House to bar the export of the N95 respirator masks outside of the United States in order to maintain to aggregate the supply here. And when Prime Minister Trudeau contacted the White House, that was immediately rescinded. And actually, the experience that we saw with regard to the N95 respirator masks manufactured by 3M and continued to be exported to Canada by 3M actually became the basis, Chris, for a broader order issued by CBP in concert with FEMA. So in fact, the United States is barring the personal protective equipment of all sorts from being exported. But there were in the order issued by Customs and Border Protection and the Federal Emergency Management Administration, out of both component agencies of DHS, there were explicit exceptions both for Canada and for Mexico in that order. So another example, I think, of how we are seeing the kind of cooperation. This is not to say that there won't be glitches. For example, there's an issue pending right now between nurses who live in Ontario and work in Michigan. And there's some pressure from both sides of the border, frankly, to, in the interests of containing the COVID-19 virus, of not permitting people to go back and forth, particularly healthcare workers. But I think the example that was set in the 3M case and more generally by the FEMA CBP order will actually lead to a sensible resolution of this latest issue. What we're seeing, Chris, is cooperative border management in a way that it reflects the work that took place between the Canadian and U.S. governments on the northern U.S. border and between the Mexican and U.S. governments on the southern border over the last 25 years. So that, in fact, this moment, while a crisis to be sure, is seeing people react based on relationships that have been developed and the trust and confidence that the two countries have in one another when it comes to border management. So good news on that front.
Thank you, Alan. That was very helpful. Catherine Friedman, you took a look at the border restrictions from the perspective of Ontario's border with the United States. your own region of Buffalo Niagara, but I know you've also looked at Detroit, Windsor, and some of the other parts of that industrial heartland. How do you see the border restriction working? And now that we're about halfway through the restricted period, what's your expectation? Will we renew this for another 30 days?
Get some updated information. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. I had the opportunity to get some updated information after I wrote the piece for the Canada Institute a few weeks ago. And I'm reporting essentially the same story. The data are telling us the same story as I reported a couple of weeks ago. So in the Buffalo Niagara region, which extends from Buffalo, New York, all the way up through Toronto, there are 4 main land crossings, and for 3 of them are owned by the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission. When compared to last year, passenger traffic is, I should say last year at this time, passenger traffic is down 97%. Bus traffic is down 100%. And commercial traffic, truck traffic, is down over 30% when compared to the same time period from last year. Similar results reported from my colleagues at the Peace Bridge Authority. Passenger traffic down 95%, bus traffic down, this is an interesting number, 99.6%. So essentially, it's shut down, and then commercial traffic is down a little over 28%. So translated, what that means is that in our region, industries like it's similar to the Pacific Northwest region that Lori's going to talk about, industries that rely on cross-border trade and travel and investment and consumerism are going to be heavily impacted. And in this particular region, that it really is tourism, right? Niagara Falls, Ontario, Niagara Falls, New York will be heavily impacted by the essential travel order. That being said, I think, as I indicated in my written remarks, I think the policy is working. I have reached out to a couple of different chambers on the U.S. side of the border in both regions, and there is a, commercial traffic is down, but that is not attributed to glitches in the supply chain. It's really more an issue of demand. And, in the Detroit, Windsor area, supply, right, with the auto manufacturers stepping back a little bit. So I do think that overall the policy is working. I echo Alan's sentiments about it serving as an example of diplomacy in action and a model that can be held up to the world. Very, very briefly, you asked about Detroit, Windsor. I reached out to a colleague in Detroit, Windsor, and she did not have a breakdown by mode, by passenger, by truck, and by bus, but overall, she had overall numbers. So since April 1st, traffic has declined through the tunnel by 88% compared to last year at this time. And at the Ambassador Bridge, let's see, what did she give me? Vehicles are down 52% through the end of March. So they've seen significant declines, but it's not broken out the same way the data were broken out for our region.
Now, the Detroit-Windsor tunnel is primarily passenger vehicles and buses, not commercial trucks, correct?
That's correct.
Right, so that would be consistent with what you're seeing in Buffalo Niagara, which is a drop in that individual travel, but that trucks are getting through supply chains in that sense for commercial shipments continuing?
That's my understanding, yes, yes.
That's very good, very good. Now let's go quickly to the West Coast and Lori Trotman. Lori, you run the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University and have been looking at the Pacific Northwest border. What are you seeing?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for being here today. I won't run through the numbers because they're very similar to Catherine's description of the Buffalo Niagara region. Certainly passenger vehicles have pretty much come to a halt. One difference between our region and particularly the Detroit-Windsor region is that we have kind of a mixed commodity in the trade that moves back and forth between British Columbia and Washington State. And I think because of that, we haven't seen quite as large of a decrease in the number of trucks moving back and forth. It's closer to 18 to 20% here, and even a little bit lower on the US bound side. So we have kind of less than loaded trucks moving back and forth with a mixture of products, not that kind of dominated by the automobile sector model out here. Certainly our cross-border travel is very, very decreased, about 97%. And in our region, somewhat similar to Buffalo, Niagara, we have a lot of people moving back and forth for tourism. There's a lot of concern about, of course, the cruise industry, which operates out of Vancouver and crosses the border in this region, not coming back at all this summer. But what's different about the Pacific Northwest compared to, say, both Buffalo, Niagara and Detroit, Windsor, is that we actually have a relatively few number of workers moving back and forth in this region. Less than 5% of people crossing the border here are crossing to work. So because so much discretionary travel happens here, and because so much of that discretionary travel is Canadians, about 75 to 80% is Canadians coming over the border, we are pretty concerned in the county where I live, which is adjacent to the border, that that discretionary spending is not going to come back very quickly once the border restrictions are lifted. And that's really going to hit particular industries and particular places quite hard, particularly some of the smaller communities that are right next to the border, where we get a lot of Canadians with their Nexus passes who are literally coming and going several times a week to fill up on gas, to go shopping, to pick up their mail order purchases. There's entire industries on the border that have built up around those Canadian consumer spending habits. And obviously, consumer spending habits are, all over the board right now and in kind of an exceptional time period. But whether or not those habits will come back once people get used to not crossing the border, to not doing those shopping trips, is really of a concern in our region.
And Lori, you were saying that there are a lot of discretionary Canadian travelers coming down. Is the flow of Americans going up to Vancouver and Whistler and so forth smaller?
Much smaller. About 20% of the people that are crossing are Canadians, are Americans. And they're doing exactly what you're saying, which is usually going into British Columbia to go to Whistler, to go skiing or mountain biking. They're engaging in longer trips, but not necessarily shopping per se. And we all know the reasons why there's less Americans shopping in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Staying with the Pacific Northwest, Solomon Wong, I know you're in Vancouver, but you also know the air transport sector. And many people think of the border, they think of the border guards, the lineups, the truck traffic. But your part of the border that you focused on in your piece for us, is really the air border. Not often seen, but just as important. Can you talk a little bit about what makes that border different and how it's being affected by the restriction?
Sure. The aviation environment is vastly impacted in terms of the passenger side of the business. Very, very similar numbers that we've seen in terms of the impact on people going across international borders. Being based here in Vancouver, and I've got operations in San Francisco and Seattle as well, you do see a trajectory of a west to east type of impact, as well as, of course, what we've talked about in terms of north-south. But the air environment is actually quite fascinating, because while the passenger side of things has declined over 90%, 95, 98% reduction in passenger activity, and that's not uncommon even for our other airports that aren't focused on the US-Canada travel. So as an example, Toronto Pearson usually has 130,000 passengers a day. There are 5,000 now. But the flights themselves, and what we've illustrated in our piece, is that the decline is not as substantial in terms of number of aircraft movement. And that's partly because cargo has really filled the void. So you're looking at air carriers like Delta, Air Canada, American. they've been out of all cargo aircraft for some time. So in 6 days, Air Canada took a 777 aircraft and converted the passenger aircraft into the ability to carry cargo on board. Now, taking the seats out, strengthening the load of the aircraft, that's been a major effort, but it's really one that has really provided the bandwidth for critical supplies, as well as keeping commerce going. So medicine, cell phone parts, strawberries, those are some things that have really been the story around why that volume of flight activity is still occurring. Now, in dealing with the air side of things, of course, we do have to recognize that from convention activities, business travel to leisure, we have a diverse set of markets that are being served, and each will have a different response and adjustments around how pandemics are treated. And remembering that this is not the first time this has happened, perhaps not to the scale of COVID-19, but we've had since SARS in 2003, followed by MERS, Zika, a range of different contagions being spread by air travel as a conduit. So I think one of the things that really is focused on, how do you actually establish that environment so that you have a way of detecting, preventing, managing risks. Much a different kind of exercise in terms of looking at how do you look at low, high risk, medium risk. As Alan rightly has pointed out for years, just that finding the needle in the haystack type of exercise is one that is looking forward for solutions to be able to advance ahead. And the air environment is really one that has been one of the conduits for super spreading.
Solomon, if I could ask you a little bit, I know Vancouver is a gateway airport for Asia. Although you're still seeing planes fly, are they flying the same patterns, or are they now doing more North American routes or routes to different places? Has Trans-Pacific flight numbers gone down?
Right. So one of the interesting things, and perhaps a lesson for future recovery, is that you do have flights from China starting up again because of the lifting of restrictions. And as different countries look at flattening the curve, we're seeing 100% full flights coming from China. On the way back, not so much, because the threat that's now being looked at is how do you deal with the second or third wave? In fact, all new cases of COVID-19 in China are from foreign sources coming back into China. So that will be a challenge to manage as well until we have a vaccine for COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Alan, I want to come back to you if you're still with us and ask you a little bit about the importance of data sharing. Certainly there's been a lot of criticism back and forth about US, China, and so forth. Whether we're getting enough data on what's happening with the epidemic, whether we're having enough data on individual personnel. We've moved towards trusted shipper and trusted traveler, where voluntarily people who cross the border often are sharing their data. How important is that domain awareness and that openness and transparency that comes with data sharing to the government's ability to restrict this border in the way that they have?
So, Chris, as all of my colleagues have indicated, this is going to create a new normal. And while we have seen enormous amounts of information sharing after 9/11 that had not taken place before, that information, for the most part, in fact, almost exclusively deals with security-oriented concerns. Traditional security-oriented concerns in terms of counterterrorism and otherwise countering transnational criminal activity. What has been pointed out by the pandemic and has escaped no one's attention on the border management side is that we are not very well equipped to deal with the reliability of supply chains. That's to say, we've done a lot to secure supply chains from transnational criminal threats, including terrorism, but we have not done virtually nothing to actually share sufficient information to be able to gauge the reliability of particular elements of the supply chain in terms of suppliers, as well as methods of clearance in and out of countries, so that we've seen, for example, in the shipment of personal protective equipment, the stops and starts that we've seen with regard to China and other supplying countries, as well as the changes in terms of what's permitted into the United States from abroad. So I think you put your finger on a critical dimension of the future that will not be what it used to be in terms of developing information. Now, in the past, we haven't had this kind of exchange among companies or between governments because of concerns over proprietary nature of supply chain information and the like. But I think what is in the offing are information technology techniques of machine learning and artificial intelligence and the so-called federated learning techniques that actually permit us to get the benefit of shared information without actually commingling data. This is a new development in information technology that I think will have a lot to do with dealing with this deficit in critical, strategically critical supply chain information going forward. So in short and summary, with regard to traditional security concerns, we're doing a lot better than we did 20 years ago. With regard to new types of information having to do with supply chain and, in fact, to some extent, public health is an area which we will need to focus on going forward. And in that regard, I also think, in addition to information technology, just listening to Catherine, Lori, and Solomon, I think that Solomon, the technology at Vancouver Airport, for example, with regard to temperature scanning and thermal scanning, I take it is still in preliminary and perhaps is not being used. But going forward, I would think that we are going to have to develop many more sophisticated techniques of scanning with regard to people than simply the traditional security scanning that we've all grown accustomed to with regard to metal detection and the like. Do you see that going forward? If I might, Chris, ask Solomon to respond.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll jump in there. And I agree with Alan in terms of the role of big data. Many have emphasized the ability to do temperature scanning, but the fact remains, finding an asymptomatic carrier of disease, let's ignore COVID-19 for a second, somebody who does not exhibit any outward sign of illness, that's really the fundamental issue going forward in terms of the challenge we face. And there are many who have promised, sure, we can find a 5-minute test for whether you're COVID-19 positive, or an hour or two. So that's one class. There's a second class, as Alan indicates, in terms of let's point a camera or device so that we can spot folks who are feverish. That's its own trajectory. But I would have to say the undiscovered territory is really what can be done with large data sets. So as China has started air travel again, the check-in process has been changed. So you go up to the agent says, please show me your smartphone, and scans a QR code. And in China, the ability to access location-based data in terms of where the individual has been, have they been in contact with a COVID-19 positive person, that's a signal that's sent back to check-in, yes or no, as the way forward. Now, before everybody gets too excited, what I've just described makes anything on privacy issues for facial recognition seem simple. So watch carefully what Google and Apple are going to release shortly in terms of a jointly developed upgrade to our iPhones and Android devices because that voluntary information, as well as anonymized groups of 20 or 50, that's actually going to be part of how large data sets is used. Because when you're dealing with technology where it's quite difficult to scale up COVID-19 detection in a day-to-day environment, and dealing with super spreading cases like what we saw in Boston with one biotech firm leadership meeting, those kinds of scenarios will play out. And I would have to agree with Alan. Exploration of big data efforts, but also the conversation on individual privacy versus public good. Those are some things that we're going to go through in terms of both the thirst for solutions, but also some creative ideas that I know folks in Canada and the United States will keep their sharp pencils on in terms of how this actually comes to fruition.
Thank you very much, Solomon and Alan. We'll be going to questions from our viewers. You'll see in the box on the screen that you can send those in by Twitter, or you can also send them to us by email at canada@wilsoncenter.org. Send those questions in, and we'll come to those in a moment. I want to come back to Lori and to Catherine, though. As much as we're talking about technology and all the things we can do to try to detect things, in your regions, I think one of the important reasons that we've had success is that individuals have gone along with all the restrictions and not tried to test the limits too much of what's essential, and chosen to personally stay away, not only stay home and respect those kind of stay-at-home orders, but also they've not been trying to test the limits of the border. How would you say, I'll start with you, Catherine, people's attitude about the COVID restrictions of the border have been? Have individual firms and individuals themselves been mostly comfortable with what they're seeing? Has there been a trust in the way this is being managed, or do you start to see their frustrations growing, perhaps?
So that's a great question, Chris. And I think in this, I think there's a difference in terms of which side of the border you live on. So on the U.S. side of the border, I think most people have the perspective that everything is working pretty well, and they will abide by the rules because they know it's short term. On the Canadian side of the border, there's a little bit more of a challenge, particularly with regard to immigration issues. Last week I spoke to a few immigration practitioners in our region, and one of the trends that they are seeing is folks, so TNs and Ls are still being processed at the border. Okay.
Those are TN and L visas?
Work permits, yes.
Yeah.
They're still being processed at the border. But what's happening is folks are coming down to the border to have their work permits processed, and then when they return to Canada, they have to quarantine for 14 days. Right? And so it's I think there's some frustration with that particular aspect of the policy. That's what I've heard in this neck of the woods.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lori, how is it in the Pacific Northwest? Something similar?
Well, we were the first state to have a case of COVID-19, and I think we were the first state to experience a death as well. And so we've been under a stay-at-home order from our governor for almost exactly a month now. And so I think, from British Columbia's standpoint, they were relieved to get a little bit of a stoppage at the border, because it was really Washington State that was more of a threat to British Columbia than the other way around in terms of our transmission and our spread. And so I think people, what we've seen at the border here is we still have people crossing back and forth, obviously, and sort of on a case-by-case basis. There's a few of them that are trying to cross for reasons that aren't considered essential. But when I say a few, really we're talking like 5 or 6 people going in either direction. So I think in Washington, we saw the value of the stay-at-home order very early because we had community transmission. It didn't feel like it was sort of placed on us as a preventative measure. It was clearly needed. But I will say that now that it's been a month, there is sort of a feeling of like, maybe this is the nation as a whole. When are we going to get back to the lives that we had before this happened? And I will say one more thing in regards to that. We have, our region overall has a very strong kind of relational fabric between British Columbia and Washington State. We have organizations like Pacific Northwest Economic Region. We have MOUs between the governor and the premier. So we have this very strong relationship going into this situation, into this crisis already. And since the border restrictions have been put in place, we actually have a whole nother on the ground cross-border task force that's been formed under kind of an emergency management response. And so we have almost every other day, we have briefings that includes Customs and Border Protection, Canada Border Services agencies, our hospitals, and we're all coming together and actually walking through exactly what's happening at the border. And I'll add one more thing before I open it up to the group, but we also have the curious case of Point Roberts out here, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a little piece of land that's connected to Canada that's actually cut off by the 49th parallel. So we have this group of American citizens that live out there, and they have to cross the border twice just to get into the mainland United States. So there's been a lot of focus on those people and that community as being particularly vulnerable given these restrictions, because they have to go back and forth just to access pharmacies and health medications and stuff like that. So a lot of really tight on the ground coordination to make sure that things are moving the way that they need to move.
And I think that's important, Lori and Catherine, you both underscore something that I think is too easy to forget, that while many of us are staying at home, we have truck drivers who are moving supply chain goods back and forth. We have hospital workers. We have our border personnel. They're all putting themselves at risk to keep the system working. And just on behalf of nobody but us, I think it's important to acknowledge that and thank them for their service, because it's they're taking a risk to keep things moving. It means a lot to all of us, and we'll get back to normal, but for them, it's already a new normal. With that, let me open it up to questions from our audience. Savannah Boylan, my colleague at the Woodrow Wilson Center, may have our first question.
Sure, we're actually going to be turning it over to Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, to ask our first question. So, Jane.
Excellent.
Thank you, and thank you, Samantha, and thank you, Chris, and thank you to the panelists. It's really interesting. So a couple things. First of all, I recall that I think it was last year, the Canada Institute had a gala in Toronto, and we honored Tom Ridge, who was the first Secretary of Homeland Security, and John Manley, who has had many jobs in Canada in the public and private sectors, including Vice Premier, for their cooperation in dealing with border issues right after 9/11. I mean, this history of cooperation between the U.S. and Canada goes back a long way. So my question is severalfold. I thought it was right that Alan said we've learned lessons from 9/11. Canada actually did very well there and has built on that. Have we learned lessons since 9/11 with respect to other countries? For example, as I said in my opening remarks, we closed our border with China, and that raises the question: are the Chinese now coming to Canada, albeit having been checked out, and then trying to get into the U.S.? Have we learned a lesson about whether that was a good move? Have we learned a lesson about closing our border to Europe? Maybe the answer there is that in both places there were a lot of cases of COVID-19. But I'm just asking this panel, which I know is a U.S.-Canada panel, whether rolling this back a bit, we could have handled those border issues better.
Let me start by turning to you, Solomon, in response to that, simply because the air border may be one of the first points of contact for trans-Pacific and transatlantic trade. Do you have a thought on this?
Yeah, I think we have some lessons learned in terms of global standards. And I think this is really both a comment on what's happened to date as well as recovery path as well, where what Jane's pointed out is there's a difference of viewpoints of measures put in place. Some are specific to countries in terms of restrictions. Others actually are within country in terms of national travel between, say, Ontario and British Columbia, or the tri-state area to Texas. Those kinds of things will evolve over time. What's needed in terms of lessons learned is the sooner we get to a set of standards in terms of what will reassure the traveling public that it is in fact safe to fly by air once again. That seems like it's far from now, but that is also a reality that the last thing trade, travel, tourism will deal well with is different kinds of forms, requirements, and measures ahead. Canada and US have demonstrated time and time again creativity to make sure that national decision making is coordinated, and whether it's Nexus, free and secure trade, or other kinds of programs, that will be as seamless as possible to the traveler or trader. So I think those are some things to look forward to. Granted, currently, we're in crisis mode, so being able to come up with good solutions collectively that's not really necessarily full throttle in terms of planning. In the paper on the Canada Institute site, I point to the less than 1% of air movements is pre-cleared right now globally. So the 22 million that CBP has in terms of pre-clearance into the United States. There are other forms of pre-clearance that will be important to look at so that where threats from or to international aviation are in place, that they're caught as early as possible in the travel continuum.
Well, thank you. Those are all things to think about. And while you're right that we may not have the answers in the crisis, it's important, I think, for us to start thinking now about where we're trying to go so that we'll have an ability as we come back on stream to anticipate some of the needs of the future. There's a lot of creativity that comes out of a crisis as well as some crisis management. Savannah Boylan, can I turn back to you for another question?
Sure. So this question I'm going to direct to Catherine and Lori to get more of an on-the-ground perspective. One of our listeners has asked, at today's briefing, the Canadian government officials have stated that travel restrictions at the border will remain for several weeks to contain COVID-19. How will this action further strain the supply chain, and how can it impact families that may be separated?
I guess I'll jump in first and say, you know, from a supply chain perspective, you know, it's hard to know how much the border restrictions themselves are causing any interruption. As I think Catherine mentioned earlier, we still see trucks going back and forth. We're still seeing goods go back and forth. There's certainly particular measures, like in Washington State, residential construction is not considered to be essential. And in Washington State, we import a lot of wood and wood products from Canada. So that's likely to see kind of a continued decline in any of those imports. We also refine a lot of oil that comes down via pipeline in refineries here in Washington, and we send that back to Canada. Now, where we're sending it to normally is YVR, Vancouver International Airport. So that decline in demand is really, I think, what's driving shifts in the supply chain more than the border restrictions themselves. And I'll touch briefly on family, because I know in our region we have a lot of family members that do cross back and forth, and we have a lot of dual citizens, and that becomes a very complicated thing when you're talking about the border restrictions, because if you're a dual citizen, you know, you're more easily able to move back and forth. But with the self-quarantine in place in British Columbia and other parts of Canada, that becomes very challenging. You know, if you can come down and visit your family because there's a medical need, that's considered essential. But when you cross back into Canada, obviously you're mandated now to be in a 2-week self-quarantine. So I think that those kinds of strains, particularly if there's a medical need by a family member or people that are isolated, those will be emotionally difficult for people to continue as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just picking up on where Lori left off, there have been a number of different stories in the newspapers in our region about the family strain that the essential travel policy has had. And in particular, you know, there's one heartbreaking story of a father who is dying of stage 4 cancer in Southern Ontario. His son is in Western New York, and his son can't visit him. His son can't see him, and his son probably will not see him before he passes away. So extending the policy for several weeks does have some very, very serious real world implications. There's no question about it. If I could just take 20 seconds and respond to the Congresswoman's question, I think, Congresswoman, that, of course, in hindsight, perhaps shutting down the borders and travel with China and other countries could certainly have been managed differently. Given what Canada and the United States have been able to accomplish. But I think that there has to be recognition of the deep respect, in my view, for diplomacy, right, between Canada and the United States, and the emphasis on relationships and diplomatic engagement and diplomatic channels. And I'm not sure that we are really seeing that with the United States, with other countries in other parts of the world. So I think maybe more focus, more investment, more recognition of diplomacy might be helpful in this environment, but I'm not sure if we're necessarily going to get there.
Savannah, we turn back to you? What's the next question?
Great. The next question is going to be for Alan Burson. And have you heard anything about a timeline for maybe additional measures, more stringent measures at the border? And if so, who would be in charge of putting together these measures?
So I actually haven't, and was, as I indicated before, I would think that the reevaluation that's going to take place in and around April 21st would provide an opportunity for us to provide more formality to the so-called hot wash, or the after-action analysis that needs to take place here. We need to identify best practices, both for the border and, as Jane suggested, for application to other countries, notwithstanding Catherine's point, which is, yes, there's a lot of trust and confidence that has to go along with that. But, there's always a balance between how far you want to bureaucratize something and how far you want to leave it to local discretion. I think in what we're hearing, and confirmed by the reports we've gotten from the Pacific Coast, as well as from the Great Lakes region, from Catherine in New York and Lori in Cascadia, is that for the most part, it's been working well, both because people have been responding to the restraint, to the partial restraint, and also because you've seen a lot of interaction between border management officials, CBSA and CBP, for example, to make this work effectively. But the question goes to a very important point. How can we actually see this taken to the next level? Because recovery from COVID-19 generally in the society is going to require not just a turnkey. It's not going to be a let's resume completely, but rather we've got to resume activities incrementally, based on data, based on testing data, based on what we might learn from serological tests of people's immunities. The border could be a very good petri dish or crucible in which we could develop best practices for how do we open up certain segments of economic activity, but do it based on data. And I haven't seen yet that the three governments have created the capacity or the mechanisms at the border or elsewhere to really begin to explore this. But I think the questioner has put her or his finger on exactly the issue: is how do we start opening up the economy, but do it based on the data that we have relating to the threat that any cross-border activity of people would involve. I haven't seen it yet, but I think it's a terrific suggestion and one that border authorities ought to consider.
Great, thanks. And before we close out this video conference, I wanted to give the speakers one last opportunity to answer a question. If there's one thing that you can see from your field of expertise that will change in the future, what would that be and why?
Well, I'll jump in and quickly say that instead of being pessimistic, because I could be, I'll be optimistic and say that, you know, I hope that this kind of situation, particularly for those that are operating on a border area, draws people's attention to the importance of our relationship with Canada and the importance of that border and the importance of communication and having those strengthened relationships. And I would hope we go that way rather than sort of a nationalist, insular way of responding to this. And I think so far it seems like we're moving in the right direction, and this could open up, as Alan sort of said, a new way of thinking about border management and a way of learning from how we're managing the border in a more strategic kind of way than happened after 9/11, for example.
Great.
Catherine,
Well,
do you want to jump
Catherine?
in?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would say, and it's something that I've said for a long time, it is absolutely a privilege to engage with so many smart, qualified, wonderful professionals in the Canada-US space. I think it is an extraordinarily unique relationship, and I think it is a relationship that needs to be highlighted globally in terms of the level of collaboration and cooperation that takes place. As Chris, as you have said, there certainly are challenges. We have to, you know, weed the garden, correct, periodically, but it really is an exemplar for how nation states can engage and engage constructively on very real and very significant challenges.
And to be fair, the weeding the garden analogy belongs to George Schultz, our former
Well,
Secretary of
yeah,
State.
well.
I don't want to take any credit away from him.
George Schultz, Chris Sands.
Solomon, what do you see coming from all of this?
Well, I imagine ourselves thinking about some of the border issues in the 1990s when some of the early solutions were thought about. So I think finding the ability to create pilot projects that will provide proof positive around the threats we're trying to manage. Those are some of the things for how the trusted traveler and trusted trader programs were created 20, 30 years ago in terms of its evolution. So there's a lot of room to be able to grow new ideas. And I would just suggest, don't just focus on technologies. Technologies is just one part of the equation. We need to look at the people side, the process side, and of course, how technology can help us be able to deal with the threats we face.
Alan Burson, did you want to have one last word?
Just two quick points, Chris. One, as we've been talking, I think this is the occasion for us to add to the history of our cooperation, but create ports of the future. And second, I think this is an occasion for all of us to recognize the importance of North America, something that just happens without a whole lot of organization, as, for example, has been the case in the European Union. We have our own integration, our own way of working together, and I think we ought to use the COVID-19 experience as a great platform to think further about how we evolve this vision of North America, North America led by Canada, Mexico, and the United States, but involving a much larger region, as we like to say in the Wilson Center study that we're conducting, North America that reaches from Colombia to the Arctic and from Bermuda to Hawaii, because that's the future, I think, in which North American leadership can best be maintained. Thanks for this opportunity, Chris and Savannah, and always a pleasure.
I'm going to add my thanks to your thanks. Thanks to all of our panelists, Alan Burson, Catherine Friedman, Lori Trotman, Solomon Wong, and thanks Savannah Boylan for helping us with the Q&A. This has been a terrific discussion. We hope to have many more as we move forward, not only with COVID, but to making North America work better, as Alan has said. For now, thank you very much for tuning in. Stay safe wherever you are and keep staying informed with Wilson Center programs. Thank you very much.